It's Mel. It is already December, and that means it's time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. I do these every month on my channel where I talk about the books that I've finished reading during the month as close to when I've read them as I can, which usually isn't that close. And I try to tell you a little bit about the books. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes and let you know what they're about, what I thought of them, and if I think you should read them as well. So the first book that I finished in December was The Three Mothers, and I don't know who it was by. The first book that I finished in December was The Three Mothers, How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. This is by Anna Malaika Tubbs, and this was a nonfiction. It was a holdover from Nonfiction November, and one that I've been wanting to read for a while. I've read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I've read The Sword and the Shield, which is a dual biography of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. I've read The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and I know that Baldwin knew many figures in the civil rights movement in America in the 60s and 70s, but obviously I didn't really know anything about the three mothers of these three great Black American men. And that's what this book is all about. This book is all about shedding light on how these three men's mothers helped them become the people that they were and helped them lead the lives that they indeed did live, and how that impacted our society, how it impacted history, and how it impacted the lives of everyone around these three mothers and their sons. This book looks at each mother from birth and even before they're born to a certain extent, the families that they were born into, all through growing up, becoming their own people, getting married, having children, having their three boys' lives, and then ultimately their three boys' untimely deaths. And a little bit about what happened to each mom after their sons died. This was definitely a very tough read. It talks a lot about how Black people were treated in America in this time. One of the mothers was born in the late 1800s, and they lived their whole lives from the late 1800s to the 1980s, 1990s. So it's a huge span of time and a huge span of political and social change for Black people in America. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely devastating. There's so many harsh topics in this. The author talks a lot about cases and how those cases may have impacted these three women. They talk about Emmett Till. They talk about various other lynchings and abuses that Black people have suffered over the years. And the author really uses those to show empathy for the situation that these three women were in, and how under these extreme circumstances and horrible conditions they raised three amazing men who went on to fight for the rights of Black people and all people in America. It was very difficult to read. I definitely cried multiple times reading this book. These stories, I think, are just so important, and they're stories that Americans are not taught, or at least not taught very often. Unless you seek out college courses or furthering education courses, or you are self-taught in these histories, you don't learn about this in America. Now, I know I have a very strange educational upbringing, being homeschooled, going to an alternative school, early matriculation into college, and all this weird stuff that I did. So sometimes I think it might just be me that doesn't know these histories and doesn't know this vital information for the social landscape of our country. But I've asked multiple people since getting into reading about social justice and the social justice political history, and no one knows them. My father, who lived through the time of Malcolm X, doesn't know these histories. So this is something that we are not taught. So I think any book that sheds any light on this subject matter is important in America today. But I will say that I think this book was more doing that, more telling some stories about social history of Black people in America than it was kind of fulfilling its goal, which is telling you about the lives of these three women. Yes, you did learn the history of these three women, and yes, it was absolutely fascinating to learn about, but I think it was told in a very nice way. That's hard to say when you know the hardships that these women went through. I think the facts in this book are amazing, but I think the tone of this book is very much nice. Like, look at all these good things that these 6 people did, which they did a lot of amazing good things. But this book glosses over the bad things that they did or the other side of people. Every person has multiple facets, and Martin Luther King was an adulterer, and Malcolm X did commit robberies, and James Baldwin might have been an openly gay black man at this time, but the book made it sound like he didn't suffer any hardships because of that. And we all know that that's not true. So I think that this book leans a little too heavily in one direction and is not the perfectly balanced history that I would like to see about these men. Many of the reasons that they became great men was the hardships that they faced and the trials and tribulations that they went through, that they weren't perfect people, that they were regular people trying to live like regular people. And one of the only reasons that they weren't treated like regular people was that they were black. And regular people have multiple facets. I did learn so much from this book. I really did enjoy especially the thesis of shedding light on Black American women in general and their plight and their trials, how they had to work so hard in the face of every adversity to raise children in this country at that time. Most of the time, these 3 mothers were ignored or almost intentionally discredited or abandoned in the tellings of these 3 men's lives. So just like Tubbs says at the end of her book, this is a great place to start, but we need more of these things and we need to learn more about women like these. So I hope that someone makes that book soon. The next book that I finished in December is The Unpleasantness at the Bellona Club by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is a Lord Peter Wimsey book. This is actually the 4th in the series, so I've read the 3rd and the 4th now. This series follows Lord Peter Wimsey, who is a rich aristocratic man living in England in the 1920s and 30s. Post World War I, he was in the war, and pre-World War II. So this is an actual Golden Age mystery. Lord Peter Wimsey has shown a spark to insinuate himself into investigations, and many people, including his friend Parker at the police, know that he is a good person to turn to when they need extra outside help. In The Unpleasantness at the Bellona Club, Lord Peter is at his club, the Bellona Club, and speaking to some of the men that he knows there, many of which are ex-soldiers from the war, some of whom were celebrated and credited, and some of whom are struggling to even survive since they've come back from fighting. He's chatting at the club with friends when someone raises the alarm that one of the older men, who happens to be the father of 2 of Peter's acquaintances at the club, has died by the fireside. Lord Peter is the first at the scene to check General Fentiman and find out if he's really dead, which of course he is, and Lord Peter immediately notices a few details that seem out of place. A few days later, when General Fentiman's solicitor contacts Peter to investigate further into the time of and manner of death, Lord Peter is ready to jump at the chance to investigate, find out the reason for some of those quirks that he noticed. This is a very classic Golden Age mystery. I really love Golden Age mysteries. I enjoy Dorothy L. Sayers. She writes in a very aristocratic, silly way. It reminds me a lot of P.G. Wodehouse. Lord Peter is very smart. He's not bungling like Wooster is from Jeeves and Wooster, but he is a rich, aristocratic dandy flitting his way through these murders, and although he takes the murders and the deaths very seriously, he has a lighthearted approach to investigation. His counterpart at Scotland Yard's is Detective Parker, who is much more straight and by the book. So they make a great team, they're great friends, and they're always trying to help each other with any cases that come their way. I've only read 2 of Sayers' books, but I feel like a trait of her books is that the way that the culprits are often caught, whether it's the major murderer or some other smaller criminals, is that basically Lord Peter says, "Did you do it?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, I did." So, like, it's a very fluffy and silly type of mystery, and I don't think that these mysteries are necessarily mysteries that you can solve. Sayers gives you clues. I don't think by those clues you can determine who did it. She gives you enough that you enjoy trying to figure out what they mean in the larger cases. For instance, she mentions in this one a telephone booth that is out of order suspiciously, so you know that's going to come back later, but how it's used you won't know until she tells you. So I can see why some people who like to figure out the mystery don't really like her works, because they don't really make sense. You can guess by inference and by tone who might have done the crimes, although I didn't guess this at all. There was even a lesser crime before the murder that I didn't guess, which I like. I don't mind that. I don't always want to be able to guess the ending. But I can see why people don't like that. This one I thought had some good twists and turns and some interesting points and definitely some interesting characters, some of which you were rooting for and some you weren't. I think one of the things I didn't like about this book was that it did have some very unlikable characters that never got their justice in the ways that I would have liked to have seen. Overall, I enjoyed it, and I will definitely be reading more Dorothy L. Sayers. I have a few more on my shelf, and I was happy to finish this. I read this for Cloak and Dagger Christmas, which is happening all throughout December, and I also read this for the Christie's Missing Readathon. Those were the first 2 books that I read in December, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is December 12th, and I've finished one more book in December. I finished Cat About Town by Cate Conte. This is a cat cozy mystery set on a fictional island summer resort town somewhere in Massachusetts. You can see more of my thoughts on this in a upcoming cat cozy mystery vlog. This follows our main character Maddie. She's returning from her life in California. She owns a business there, but she has to come back to the island to see her family when her grandmother dies. Luckily, she's able to spend some time with her grandmother before she passes, and then she gets to spend time with her grandfather, who's one of the people that she's closest with in her family. Her grandfather has been seeming off, though, and after the funeral he lets her know that issues are coming up, money things, problems with his house, and he's worried with all the medical bills from his wife what is going to happen to his house. It seems that some people in the town want him to give it up, to be demolished and replaced with more modern accommodations for all the tourists flooding in. Just around the same time that she finds this out, she also finds a stray cat near her mother's grave. Since Maddie is a cat lover and has worked in shelters before, she ends up adopting the cat and naming him JJ. Maddie's grandfather says that a prominent person, the head of the Small Business Alliance and Chamber of Commerce on this small island, has been the one pushing him to sell the house, and Maddie goes to confront him. Unfortunately, a few hours later, this man is found dead, and Maddie is the one who discovers the body. So we go from there, and it is your typical cozy mystery. There's some other crimes that happen, and Maddie has to become an amateur sleuth and discover who on the island might have wanted this man dead and who is trying to help her grandfather by donating money and time to fix his house. I think this was like a very typical cat cozy mystery or cozy mystery in general, but I like that it had the backdrop of a small beach town. Since I live in a tourist-driven beach town, that's kind of close to my heart, and I definitely picked up on the idea of all the people, the old-timers who don't want things to change, the new people coming in, the ambitious, rich go-getters who are trying to fix up the town so that new tourists will come come in and who will stop at nothing to do that. While it definitely hit the mark for me on those counts, there was no larger issues talked about here. There was no relevance to the real world in any way. I mean, it was cute to see those things and see my own town in this fictional town, but it wasn't revolutionary or overly compelling. It also was definitely overly long, where you didn't even get a real clue to who the killer might be till well after halfway through, and then that felt kind of forced, and there was no way for a reader to really know who the killer was going to be, or to have solved the mystery on their own. When the suspect comes up, it's fairly obvious who they are, and from that point on, you're just waiting to see how they get there. I also didn't love Maddie's character. She's like kind of full of herself, and of course her ex-boyfriend lives on the island, as well as some new potential love interests. She kind of strings them all along and makes them do things without being at all like thankful or appreciative of the efforts that they're doing. She just kind of steamrolls over them and expects them to help her just because she's so great. That was the third book that I read in December. It is December 13th. I finished The Secret Adversary by Agatha Christie. This is the first in the Tommy and Tuppence series, and we follow young Tommy and Tuppence as they meet up again. They played together as children, and then they've met several times over the years. But currently it's after the First World War, and Tuppence has had many different jobs, but she doesn't have one at the moment, and she's broke. Tommy was a soldier in the war, well decorated, but injured several times, and he can't seem to find work either. So they decide to join up and become adventurers. This luckily works out extremely well because Tuppence stumbles on an adventure right away, and they get embroiled in espionage and mystery and murder and kidnapping and all sorts of amazing adventures the day after they decide to become these young adventurers. This is the first Tommy and Tuppence book I've read by Agatha Christie, and I really enjoyed it. I love when Agatha writes young people. They're so silly and brash and funny and romantic and unromantic, and there's just so much going on in this one. I do think that kind of towards the end when they were resolving things, it did drag a little bit. I think that has more to do with my tastes and not really loving like spy adventures and spy books and espionage than that the book was not wonderful. I 100% fell for the red herring. There was always a question whether it was going to be the person that it turned out to be or the red herring, but I 100% fell for the red herring. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm looking forward to reading more Tommy and Tuppence. The next book that I finished was Evidence of the Affair by Taylor's Jenkins Reid. After finishing The Secret Adversary on audio, I needed a new audio while I was working at my office job. I had a bunch on my Audible account that I had downloaded for free. Now, I like to do that periodically because if you have Audible but don't have a subscription to Audible, which is what I do, you can get free audio stories. So these are all like short stories or novelettes. Evidence of the Affair is by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I have only ever read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but I really enjoyed that one. I still do want to read Malibu Rising. But Evidence of the Affair is one that I downloaded before I really even knew who she was. It just sounded kind of interesting because it's set in the 70s and it is an epistolary novel. This follows a wife who discovers that her husband has been cheating on her and writing letters to someone else's wife. So she writes a letter to the other husband, lets him know that this affair is going on, and asks him to send the other side of the letters. So these two have a correspondence through letters, getting to know each other and talking about their two problematic marriages. And then you also get the letters from the cheating husband and cheating wife a little bit to understand better their relationship. This was a super quick audiobook was only like an hour and 15 minutes or something, but it was read by some really good people. So Julia Whalen and a few other good voice actors read this one, which made it even more compelling. Now, I love epistolary novels. I know some people do not. I'm looking at you, Kieran, but I love epistolary novels. So this one really was interesting to me, and I liked the progression of learning about these two people, learning about their marriages, learning about why their marriages were failing, and then their subsequent friendship and relationship, and then the conclusion of all these things through letters. Would highly recommend it, especially if you just pick it up for free like I did. And those were two more books that I read in December, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is December 21st, and many days ago, I finished two more books. I finished The Black Pages by Nnedi Okorafor. This was a free original short story that I get with a subscription, similar to The Evidence of the Affair. When I'm in between audiobooks, I've been going through and just reading some of these short stories on audio, partly to get rid of them, and partly because I've been wanting to read them. Nnedi Okorafor is most well known for the Binti series, I think, and I did read the first Binti book, and I did enjoy it. That was Afrofuturism. The Black Pages was about a young man who is returning to Timbuktu from being at school in America. He's coming to visit his family, and as he is coming home, the Taliban is just finishing their occupation of Timbuktu. So there are the French and other people coming in to rescue and liberate Timbuktu, and one of the things that's happening is that the Taliban is targeting anything that they kind of had their eye on to obliterate while they were reigning that they didn't get a chance to yet. As the man is trying to catch a bus and trying to get home to his family, one of the libraries is burnt down and the librarian is murdered. Those events lead to sacred texts being rescued by members of this man's family, and by one of them escaping and seeking out this man who the text will protect, and he will protect the text. This story definitely has magic and intrigue, and it has political overtones of things that were happening at this time in Timbuktu, and a little bit of like the Timbuktu history woven into an extremely short, extremely easy to digest short story. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very atmospheric and it was quite poignant. There are people who die in this story, and although you're not like super connected because it was only about an hour audiobook, you do feel for the young man and his predicament, and it leaves you definitely questioning what might happen next, which I like about short stories. Although it has similarities to Binti in that there are aspects of the story that I don't really have any reference for or knowledge of, it was also similar to Binti in that you can be projected into this world without really needing to know every single thing about it. So it was good and entertaining and compelling enough in that way that it was easy to become immersed in. The next book that I finished in December is The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont. This is a historical fiction that came out in 2022. This is an arc I got at a library sale. It follows the mistress of Agatha Christie's husband. Agatha Christie famously went missing for 13 days in December of 1926. No one knows where she went, and her entire life she maintained that she herself could not remember. There was lots of press and scrutiny at the time. There was a huge search put out for her at the time, but ever since then, and still, it remains one of the greatest mysteries. This fictional story tells us what may have happened to Christie while she was missing, and it's all told through the mistress. Her name in the story is Nan, and she's telling us her story, the story of her past, the story of what happened to her those 13 days, and how she and Agatha's lives intertwined. This book felt so natural and fun and just a page turner to read. I really liked Nan's narration of the story to us and how she pretty effortlessly wove two storylines and two timelines, her own current storyline and her past, into this story and made it feel like a very familiar and casual telling of this story to the audience. There's definitely some mystery and intrigue, some romance, and some shocking moments. I appreciated that this book dealt with very heavy topics, and topical topics in a way, because it talked a little bit about the Magdalen laundries and other places where unwed pregnant women were sequestered in Ireland. That recently has been more highlighted in BookTube because of Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which was nominated for the Booker Award. This touched on lots of heavy subjects that have to deal with that and other things. There's definitely trigger warnings for rape, theft of children, kidnapping, abuse, religious abuse, and many, many other things, adultery. This book didn't gloss over those things, but it also didn't dwell on them to a explicit extent. So you knew that bad things were happening. They were impactful and horrible to the characters, and you did feel for those characters, but you didn't get super graphic scenes of sexual violence. You didn't get super graphic depictions of torture. So I liked that it had that, and it let the reader know those things were happening and be able to use their imagination without hitting them over the head with the gruesome nature of those things. I don't know how much of the story is real or fiction, which I think worked to my advantage reading this. I know Agatha and her first husband broke up, and I know that Agatha went missing, and I know that she didn't tell anyone where she went, but I don't know if this woman, Nan, existed either as herself, Nan O'Day, or if Nan O'Day was just a symbol of Mr. Christie's improprieties. I'm not sure if Mr. Christie actually cheated on Agatha. I'm not sure if there was a mistress or if Agatha knew her like she does in this book, or knew of her like she does in this book. So it felt very real to me. Like, there's definitely some parts of this that are like very convenient and definitely plot devices and a little bit silly, but it felt very real and believable and compelling, and it was a page turner. I didn't love the ending, but it didn't ruin my enjoyment of this book in any way. It just wasn't like my favorite part. And that was The Christie Affair, which was the 7th book that I've read in December, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is December 26th, and I finished 3 more books in December. I finished Down the Shore with a Golden Retriever by Kim Saraulo. This is a indie published homemade book that I found in a little free library last year about Sammy the Golden Retriever and how he came to live out the rest of his days on the Jersey Shore. Something very gross is on the back of it. I don't know if that was there before I picked it up or acquired in my house, but this was just a sweet little homemade book that I wanted to read and will be passing on. The next book that I finished in December is The Mall and the Pear Tree by P.D. James and T.A. Critchley. This is a true crime written in the 70s about the Radcliffe Highway murders, which took place in the slums of London in 1811. So this is pre-Jack the Ripper, and it was some horrific murders of 2 families and their servants, and I would probably say that this is an early true crime book written by one of my favorite mystery writers, P.D. James. So I wanted to pick it up because I want to read all of P.D. James' work. I'm not much of a true crime reader in general. I do like Eric Larson because his true crime is inextricably linked with the history of the time, which I really appreciate. And this had a little bit of that, a little bit of like how the police system worked. P.D. James is known for her detective Adam Dalgleish, who works for the London Police Department, so I can see why learning more about early police systems would interest her. I read this for Cloak and Dagger Christmas. If overall I didn't think this was an entirely successful book, I think that the evidence and information about the murders was very slim just because of the time period, and so much information had gone missing between the crimes and when P.D. James wrote this book. I also don't think it did like an amazing job of moving the story along and advancing the history of the story, whereas Erik Larson's book are really incredible for that. I am happy to have read it, but I don't know if I would 100% recommend it. Another book that I read in December is Oh Gee It's Christmas, an Ocean Grove mystery by Heath P. Boyce. This is another super indie press, homemade little book. It's got some really terrible formatting and some horrible sentence structure and a little bit of racism. This was written in 2014, and it takes place in the small Victorian town Ocean Grove, which is the town right next to mine, which is why I wanted to pick this one up. It's like 86 pages. I read it, it's 90 pages. I read it all in one day on Christmas Day. I flew through it. It's not very good. Although it takes place in a real location, Ocean Grove, New Jersey, it fabricates a lot about Ocean Grove, and one of the things is that Ocean Grove houses Asbury College, where Dean Doug, our main character, is a dean and takes care of the student body. It's a Methodist school, but it's also a private college, so anyone can go there. Dean Doug has lots of adventures and crimes are committed, and he solves them apparently in other books. In this book, Dean Doug has to wrangle the student body, the elderly of Ocean Grove, and two unexpected babies when a huge snowstorm hits the Jersey Shore and debilitates Ocean Grove. So it's got a little bit of a manger story, it's got a little bit of a parenting story, it's got a little bit of a Christmas spirit story, everyone gathering together. It has kind of a ghost of Christmas involved in it, and it's a mess. It's a total mess. But good for Heath P. Boyce that he wrote this book, that he published it, that he's written other books. And if I ever saw any of his other books at library sales, like I found this one, or Ocean Grove yard sales or something like that, I would definitely pick them up. And those are 3 more books that I read in December. It is December 30th, and I have finished 2 more books in December. I finished these quite a few days ago, but I finished Sleep No More by P.D. James. This is 6 murderous tales, so this is 6 short stories, and I was reading this for Cloak and Dagger Christmas and Christie's Missing Readathon, and because I love P.D. James. In this collection, she has short stories that range from the 1970s to the early 2000s. I liked many of these stories. There was a couple that I didn't like with all short story collections. Some were really, really appealing to me and some were less so. I do think that P.D. James does this subversive technique in her short story writing where she tells you almost the entire short story as if the main character in the short story is just relating you the facts, and then it turns out that that person was actually inextricably intertwined with the crime somehow. So she really turns it on her head where you think you're hearing about a crime from an outsider's eyes, and then at the end of the story it is revealed that that person was actually part of the crime, possibly committing the crime. I've seen her do that in other short stories as well, but it always takes me by surprise, and I think it's always an interesting technique, a different kind of twist than your more typical mystery twist. So if you are interested in P.D. James, I would definitely highly recommend reading her short stories as well. I think I liked the other short story collection. I read The Mistletoe Murders more than this one, just because it did have a story following Adam Dalgleish when he was a young detective, although I did enjoy a lot of the stories in this one as well. The next book that I finished in December is What Are You Going Through by Sigrid Nunez. This was my TBR Tackle pick for December, my very last TBR Tackle book for 2022 and possibly forever, so you can see more of my thoughts in my vlog. I do vlog all of my TBR tackle books, and I have a vlog coming out for this one as well. This follows possibly an unnamed narrator as she observes people in her life. She's been traveling to the town where her friend lives to visit her friend who's in the hospital with cancer. She has noticed different things. She observes the Airbnb host that she's staying with. She observes a lecture by someone that from her past that she happens to notice is going on. She has all these small, quiet interactions with people she knows or strangers, and then the whole story kind of revolves around her relationship with her friend who is in the hospital with cancer and a question and request that her friend makes of her that kind of carries us through the rest of the book. This is a very short book. I read it on audio. I really enjoyed the audio narration, although I think this would have been a fun one to read physically as well. Very, very quick. It has a lot to do with how people come in and out of each other's lives and how they can affect us differently at different times. There's a certain amount of repetitiveness of things that she sees within her friends that she had previously seen in other people, or connections that she has with her friend that she had with other people. There's a lot about grief and grieving losses that are not yet gone. The idea of grieving people before they are dead or buried, but also like once they've left your life, grieving time, grieving different people who you were in your life and throughout your life. And I guess it's all, the idea is that if we can say, what are you going through, to another person and really understand their answer. I did enjoy this one. I'm glad to have read it. Sigrid Nunez, I think, is most recently known for her novel The Friend. This book was interesting because it did touch briefly on animal grief as well, and I think that her more current book, The Friend, is very much about that. So I don't know if I would want to read that one, but I've heard only good things, and I would recommend this if you're looking to dip your toe. Those were 2 more books that I read in December. It is January, and I finished the last book in December on the last day of December, and that was A Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I have been wanting to read this book and or a Jean Rhys book for quite a while now. I keep picking up her books because I think I'm really going to enjoy her writing, but I haven't read any of them. So when I found out that this would fit the Buzzword Readathon and complete my Buzzword Readathon for 2022, I decided to pick it up. This is about a young girl living in Jamaica. She is a Jamaican but of white descent or mixed race descent. Her mother and her brother live together after her father has died. So they live on a plantation, and the local population really doesn't like them. They really harass them and cause trouble, and it's causing a lot of stress for her family, especially her mother's mental health. Her brother is disabled and not able to move around or do a lot, and really the family wouldn't survive without the help of their servants and the people who are working in their house who are loyal to them, because the majority of, especially the Black families in the area, don't like them and kind of ostracize them and want them out. Our main character's mother's mental health is declining, but she does manage to pull it together long enough to remarry another white man and get this man to kind of refurbish the plantation and bring new life to the family. Our main character is happy that her mother is doing better mentally, but the aggression of the townspeople really takes an extreme turn and they are forced to leave the plantation. When this happens, many members of her family are injured and her mother's mental health declines even further and she becomes estranged from her mother. Our main character ends up staying with her aunt and then later going to a convent, and then we take a time jump and we see our main character being married off to an Englishman. This is a marriage of convenience and it is mostly to give our main character's inheritance to this Englishman and kind of get her off the hands of her stepfather's family. That's the general premise of this book. It is connected to a classic. It's kind of a prequel slash retelling of an aspect of a classic. If you know what it is, you know. If not, you can certainly go and look it up. But I think that this book is best read on its own because I've never read that classic, but what I found was that because I knew the end through just like pop culture osmosis, I wasn't as inclined to pick this one up as often because there was no motivation to find out exactly what happened in the end of the story because I kind of knew what happened. So I would suggest reading this alone as a standalone, or if you've already read that classic, reading this because you want to see this potential prequel to that story. Either way, it doesn't paint the classic in a great light. I liked the writing a lot. I'm definitely interested to read more Jean Rhys because this is one of her last books, so I would like to see what some of her earlier works are like. This book reminded me a lot of Ellen Foster, which is a kind of American semi-modern classic. It takes place in the American South, and it is about a young white girl living in a poor black neighborhood who's ostracized kind of by the entire neighborhood because of her race and because of her poor stature and things like that. So it had a lot of parallels. It's also told from the perspective of that young girl, just the same as Wide Sargasso Sea is. And it's also a lot about our main character's mental state, and it takes place mostly in their head, and how in some ways both of these girls have had to grow up very quickly. In other ways, their growth has been stunted, and so their mental state is an interesting one to be reading from. That was the last book that I read in December, and like I said, this completes the Buzzword Readathon. I of course read a lot of mysteries for Cloak and Dagger Christmas and Christie's Missing Readathon. I read some nonfiction like The Three Mothers and The Mall and the Pear Tree. I read some works by people of color like What Are You Going Through and The Three Mothers. I also read a short story by Nnedi Okorafor. Did any of the books have queer representation? Not really. Any of the books had queer rep in it this month, which is a shame. I got to quite a few books on my physical TBR, so that's exciting. And overall, I had a really great reading month. I love mysteries. Mysteries are like my favorite genre and my most read genre, but I do think this was a little mystery heavy, and some of the mysteries turned out to be a little bit more forgettable because I was reading so many in a row. So I was glad to switch it up with like my last TBR tackle book, which was a contemporary story about grief, and I was glad that I got to read a couple of different things. Overall, I think it was a lot of the same kind of books this month, so hopefully in January I will read a wide range of different things. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know what your best book of December 2022 was, and I will see you very soon for another video. So thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!